got my VR headset on. I'm inside this duck's genitalia, and I'm looking around at this incredible long tube, and I was like, now this is where some serious evolution has happened. This is where some serious adaptations have happened. I wonder if we could retell that story literally from the perspective of animal eggs, which, as we know, are universal.
Jules Howard is a zoologist, broadcaster and author, exploring everything from our relationship with animals to our understanding of mortality. But recently, he's been taking a look at how we can retell the story of evolution through the unlikely lens of eggs. Jules, it's great to have you back here at the RI. Evolution is literally a tale as old as time and has been explored from a huge number of different angles. But in your latest book, you look at it from a relatively unseen perspective, and that is one from the humble egg. I'm dying to know, why eggs?
It's a great question. Yeah, you're right. There are a lot of books, and I remember, hearing about the evolution of animals, and I was always like, I'd be very interested in thinking of a different way of telling that story. And I had an experience about 4 years ago where I created a 3D model of a duck's genitalia.
Wow.
And people wore virtual reality glasses, and it was all available for free on Google Play. And I had great fun making it. And it was a way to sort of show people, I suppose, that the internal, female genitalia is actually really, really interesting. And everyone knows all about male phalluses in the animal kingdom, and, there's so many stories there, but the internal anatomy the story of that hadn't really been told. So anyway, I've got my VR headset on. I'm inside this duck's genitalia, and I'm looking around at this incredible long tube, which essentially is like an egg-producing. You could almost call it a car wash. So it's basically an egg-producing tube. And I was like, now this is where some serious evolution has happened. This is where some serious adaptations have happened. I wonder if we could retell evolution, how things adapt, how they modify according to ecosystems. If we could tell that story literally from the perspective of animal eggs, which, as we know, are universal. And it was a sort of challenge to myself. And here we are at the end. And I'm like, oh my gosh, that's actually a really novel and creative and hopefully quite cool way to talk about the evolution of life on this planet.
So you mentioned that this kind of comes from your work looking at ducks' reproductive physiology, and they have a rather unique one, which I think some people know and some people don't. Could you kind of tell us a little bit more about that and the car wash analogy that you mentioned, and elaborate on that a little bit?
So that is a great example of females evolving, in that case, a way to control reproductive opportunities. But essentially, she'll let the right male in, and then the male will fertilise her eggs, and that's kind of where the story begins. So the sperm's at the top of the tube, egg pops out and is fertilised, and then the egg starts its journey. And I called it a car wash, and it kind of is. I can't get this analogy out of my head, really, but this is the same for all birds and probably many dinosaurs. The egg starts off as a sort of jelly. It's a bit like a ping pong ball, but it's all squidgy. And essentially, as it moves through the egg tube, there's kind of contractions to keep it moving. It moves past all these little nozzles on the outside of the external surface of the tube. And as the egg is pushed past, it sort of compresses these little nozzles, and stuff is squirted out, essentially. Mm-hmm. So the first layer is it's a little bit like, like silly string.
Yes.
And it's sort of loads of it, so it makes this complex mesh. And that's the most simple membrane. Lots of reptiles have the same sort of membrane to the egg. And then, obviously, in birds and some dinosaurs, we see the next layer, which is like a sort of calcium-rich foam, which is sort of squirted onto it. And that takes a little bit of time to harden. And then the egg tube essentially is now an egg with a hard shell. And then it moves on to the next bit, and there's nozzles to apply colours and sort of beautiful blues and greens that we see on many birds. And then at the end is the sort of varnish, if you like. So these are nozzles that make the egg a really hard surface for bacteria and fungal parasites to land upon. So it sort of deters invaders, essentially. So this thing, unfortunately, I'm unbearable now if I'm holding a boiled egg. But it is just amazing when you think about this structure that we all know so well, that's in all of our iconography. We have whole festivals around eggs. And actually, this thing is just constructed in the most marvellous way, basically.
So we're going to get on to dinosaurs and where that comes into the question and story about eggs and their physical appearance later on. But for now, let's have a little look back at the story of eggs and where it started. So eggs aren't something that have evolved recently in any way, shape or form. They've been a really pivotal part of reproduction and development throughout the history of living things. So how far back can we trace the existence of eggs?
You are right, a long time ago. So if you think about the earliest animals, if you think about them as kind of almost like microorganisms really bobbling around in the ocean, we think eggs were around at the very beginning of animals. There are certain genes that are spread all the way across the animal kingdom from jellyfish right through to us. And these genes control the formation of sperm cells. And they're very similar across all animals. So they all inherited from the same source, if you like, all from the same shared ancestor. And the last time that jellyfish and humans shared ancestors was possibly about 1,000 million years ago, so about 1 billion years ago.
Quite a while then.
Yes. So if there was sperm, there had to be eggs. And this is a very universal thing that animals are kind of addicted to. The whole concept of sex is one of the things that we sort of excel at as organisms. We think it goes back a long time. As far as the actual evidence that we can look at, there are some beautiful fossils in parts of China called the Deshuanto Formation. And it's these fossils are about 635 million years ago. So long before the Cambrian explosion. This is like when we think the world was just kind of full of jellyfish-like animals, essentially. And yeah, these scientists, they're amazing. They don't bother looking at T-Rex fossils or, large fossils. They're really interested in tiny fossils. They're about the width of a human hair, and they're really hard to find. So you have to clean away all of the sediment from these fossils and sort of pick out these little dots, put them on a microscope. And if you study them with the right lighting, you can actually see that sometimes the actual cells within those fossil eggs that are really small, you can actually see them dividing. So you can see in some of them, you can see 2 cells. Some of them have 4, never 5. It's always 4 or 8 or 16. So we think, these are the earliest evidence of proper eggs, I would say, as we know them in the modern world. So 635 million years ago, absolutely amazing. Now, what are they from? There's loads of, as is beautiful about this science that we love so much, really, loads of arguments. Some think they might be early jellyfish-like animals. Some sort of suspect they might be early worm-like. But either way, they're there and they can be observed and properly looked at.
These eggs that we think may have, let's say, originated from jellyfish-type animals all those years ago, do they look similar to the eggs that we see today, or have they evolved and developed over time?
Yeah, I suppose at their most basic, they'd seem very similar to the eggs that you might see jellyfish lay or corals. So these look like, they almost like little pearls. You could just think of it as like a hard-wearing vessel that can float or sink, depending on the species. So some of them float near the surface and do their development there in the sunlight. Some of them land on the floor and become a bit like a coral first on the floor before having a reproductive stage that looks a bit like a jellyfish. But essentially, it's hard for us to tell from fossils, but almost certainly one of the first adaptations of the egg was that boundary to sort of kick out viruses and to kick out bacteria that are trying to invade. So probably that harder surface is one of the first adaptations I reckon we would have seen in those eggs.
So now that we know eggs have a very, very, very long history, does that mean we finally have an answer to what came first? Is it the chicken or the egg?
Do you guess how often I'm being asked that question? Do you know what? At first, as I was writing this, I was like, I bet people are going to ask me that question. That's going to be a popular one. You often find there's one thing that people come back to, which is really good, really important to have a starting point. And the chicken and the egg, that paradox, we love it as, human societies. It's a classic. So at first I was like, any zoologist is going to go, right, listen, chicken, 10,000 years old, that is relatively recent domestication. And then you're like, well, chickens are part of the group, obviously, of birds. Birds evolved 150 million years ago from theropod dinosaurs, the 2-legged dinosaurs. So, yeah, we're talking 150 million years. So 10,000 for chicken versus 150 million years for birds. I've got to say it's got to be the egg that came first. However, I must admit, in the last couple of weeks, the more I think about it, I've actually turned into one of those kind of annoying, like, oh, yes, but it's a paradox. You think about, jungle fowl running around 10,000 years ago. There must have been a moment when male jungle fowl met female. Their genes go into that egg, and inside that egg is the exact genetics of the organism that will become chicken, or it will be named chicken. It is a really, really beautiful question. So I found myself, and also, like, what is a species really? Like, what is a chicken really?
Well, that's the thing. Is it what came first, the chicken DNA or the
Yes.
egg DNA?
Yes.
And then you just go down that whole rabbit hole. So
Yeah, exactly.
maybe
So
we'll never know.
Maybe we will never know. But I tell you what, it's a lovely way to sort of go into quite a deep place with eggs that I suppose most of us don't normally do. So I'm all for it.
Well, you heard it here first. We don't have an answer. Something that you mentioned in the book that we've touched on a bit already, that people probably don't associate with eggs, I certainly didn't, is the extinction of dinosaurs. So was it not an asteroid?
It's definitely to do with the asteroid or the meteorite. And I think most paleontologists would definitely agree with that. Although in the past, obviously, there was a bit of debate. It just seems like such a destructive event, and one that affected, obviously, birds and mammals and many other types of groups, apart from insects, but let's not go there. So essentially, the main theory, or the theory I think we were all told, the hypothesis, I guess, we're all told, is, dinosaurs, big meteorite, boom, explosion, dust cloud, no photosynthesis, no food, goodbye dinosaurs. So essentially, it's a starvation event. But I mean, I've always found that kind of a little bit basic because, other groups, crocodiles, for instance, many of those were quite large in size. And even the smaller ones are still quite large animals, approaching 25 kilograms or so. So yeah, they seem to do all right, or at least a few of them survived and made it to the modern day. So there's something else going on. And whilst researching this book, eggs are clearly a part of this story. It's not a part of the story that is told, as far as I'm known, on TV. I've never seen it mentioned in documentaries or anything like that, but it's really interesting. So here goes, right. By looking at fossils of dinosaur embryos, and amazingly there are a few, we can see that a bit like when you chop open a tree, you can count the rings, right? You can kind of do the same with dinosaur teeth with their buds.
Wow.
In their gums. And they're so cute. They're really lovely. They look like little jelly babies almost, but except they're fossils.
Wouldn't eat one, though.
No.
Don't try this at home.
But within this, you can measure the speed at which the dinosaur embryo grows. And one resounding fact in the dinosaur embryos that have been studied so far is that they grew pretty slow. So you think about bird eggs, they hatch mostly within weeks. That's quite fast, quite a dynamic process. In dinosaurs, the process is more like months. So birds, weeks, dinosaurs, months. And I think it's quite feasible to suggest that in a world where food is scarce and animals are desperately trying, well, they're not trying, of course, they are repopulating whole ecosystems and finding new niches to specialize into. Those animals that do it fastest and adapt most quickly are the ones that can exploit all of these empty resources left behind after the big explosion. So dinosaurs, if they're reproducing slowly, if they're stuck with this slower rate of egg repopulation, they are obviously more likely, we think, to fall to the hands of their rivals, the birds and the mammals. So undoubtedly eggs are part of the story of dinosaurs. And yeah, it's nice to give it a little bit more of a showcase.
A lot of what we know about dinosaur eggs themselves has only really come to light relatively recently in comparison to how long ago they were kicking about. A landmark paper was released in 2018 and it revealed that dinosaurs themselves actually had different egg colours, and it's not just a feature of birds that evolved later on. Why do eggs have different colours and patterns?
That's a really good question. Yeah, you're right. Across birds, in many but not all species, we see different patterns, like I say, pencil markings maybe, or actual blobs, or whole, blues and greens especially. And those blue and green colours, I read actually that, when you get a bruise and your bruise goes blue and then green.
Yes.
And this is because of the breakdown of blood products or something like that. And it creates basically a compound that is the same compound used in birds' eggs, interestingly.
Wow, that's fascinating.
It's really cool. So yes, blues and greens tend to be the go-to colours for birds. And then obviously that was an amazing discovery, a really fascinating discovery in those dinosaurs that lay hard-shelled eggs. For a long time, this is one of those mysteries that has probably been discussed in this very room 150 years ago. Alfred Russel Wallace was like, it's all about camouflage. And then other scientists of the day were saying, that's a bit weird. Why would a blackbird's egg be so green if you can't see it from the ground? So that doesn't make sense. If it's in a nest, it doesn't need camouflage. But there was an interesting observation that things like kingfishers, which have eggs in burrows, don't have any markings. They just have nice, white, clear eggs. So it's like, could it be about camouflage? Don't know. And then there were scientists that were suggesting it might be about the sun. So ostrich eggs, for instance, which are basically sitting in the sunlight most of the day. Their markings or any colours there might be about sunscreen. So this is a big problem for eggs all over the world, and has been for about 1,000 million years, is that the sun essentially is trying to break down eggs, smash them to pieces with the photons. And then later on came an absolutely lovely idea, a great hypothesis, that it was actually about parasites, nest parasites. So if you think of cuckoos, for instance, they're always looking around, and then if they see a nest unguarded for a moment, they might lay an egg in that nest and then hope that their baby won't get noticed by the new parents when they come home, the hosts. And actually, what we see in those species that are parasitized a lot, so in Britain it might be warblers, for instance, that they have a really kind of high rate of egg evolution, I guess you could say. And essentially the way it goes is if you, if we are a female, let's both be female birds, okay?
Sure.
And we've got a cuckoo in the room. It's in our interest to create kind of funky, crazy-looking eggs, because the cuckoo that's in the room can't evolve quickly enough to make eggs that look as cool and funky as ours, right?
Yeah.
Except obviously, given time, the cuckoo, natural selection will select those that can best unthinkingly mimic, our eggs, and so we carry on evolving. So it's a lovely Red Queen bit of evolution where, it's like an evolutionary arms race, essentially. So yeah, that's the theory, and it's backed up by some pretty good evidence now, lots of data from the field. So that begs the question: is what's going on with dinosaurs? It could well be there were dinosaur versions of cuckoos.
Parasitic dinosaurs.
Parasitic dinosaurs.
Wow, that's a
and
scary
there is
thought.
even one fossil, and to be honest, this is just, I would say this is almost anecdotal, okay, because it's literally one fossil. But there's a Protoceratops nest, okay, so Protoceratops, herbivore we think, and within that fossil nest there are two little baby oviraptors. So the question is, what are they doing there? What's going on there? They could be little cuckoos living inside that nest, which would be absolutely amazing. So looking at the evidence, I would say it's pretty likely that there were these amazing little cuckoo dinosaurs running around.
So another recent discovery in dinosaur egg research, a very fast-moving area of research apparently, is to do with the type of eggs that dinosaurs had. So it was discovered back in 2020 that some dinosaur eggs actually had soft shells like turtles do. But a study posted just a few weeks ago, hot off the press, by a collaboration of Chinese paleontologists, suggests that apart from these soft and hard shells, there's actually an entirely different type of dinosaur egg that had previously gone completely under the radar. So what is the difference between soft and hard shelled eggs to start with?
Yeah, I mean, if we go back to our car wash of eggs, right?
Of course.
Okay. So I mentioned at the start there was the one that was a bit like silly string, and essentially it's coming out all directions, creating this meshwork, and that's a very simple membrane surrounding the egg. Crucially, it can breathe as well. That's very, very important. So we think that's the kind of basic reptile egg. So they would call it the amnio egg. It's basically a really advanced membranous egg with loads of bits in it that can do different jobs. You think about the eukaryote cell and how it's like a cell and there's cool bits inside it. That egg is a bit like that. It's a really cool innovation that reptiles took on, the amnio egg. The basic amnio egg we think was soft-shelled. And the reason we think that is because we just don't find fossils of them. There are loads and loads of fossils, as we know. The unbelievable numbers of different fossils from even before dinosaurs, so 250 million years ago. Spectacular places like South Africa where we can really get an idea of the animal forms. We just don't really see the babies, which is kind of weird.
Yeah, they must have existed.
Yes, exactly. And I think one of the ideas is that, a lot of reptiles, for instance, lizards might lay their eggs in sort of vegetation. And obviously vegetation is just rubbish for making fossils because it obviously decomposes so quickly. So it could well be something to do with that. But those, in the early dinosaurs, the embryo fossils that we find, for ages they were just thought to be, oh wow, these are just baby dinosaurs. But looking at the way they're posed, and birds do this as well, they form like a lovely little pose where they tuck their face essentially in their armpit, their left armpit. And looking at these fossil embryos of dinosaurs, it's like, okay, that's interesting. So essentially by looking with special microscopes, we can see it's almost like a halo around each embryo, incredibly thin, and essentially that is one of the first, we think, fossilized soft-shelled eggs. So the idea goes, and again, there's not enough to go on yet. I think more fossils and more discoveries will help us. But essentially, dinosaurs start off soft-shelled, and then certain parts of the dinosaur family evolve harder-shelled later on. So the big group that invested in it was the theropod dinosaurs, the two-legged ones like, T-Rex and Velociraptor. The better question is why? What's so good about a shelled egg? Most animals on Earth don't lay hard-shelled eggs, so what's so good about them? One of the most exciting ideas is that larger shelled eggs, essentially, they are structured better. If you imagine a soft shelled egg, the size of a pool ball, if the shell's soft, it's at risk of falling in on itself. So by having hard-shelled eggs, it means that the embryos within them can grow to can hatch out at a larger size. And we see that quite a lot. Animals that are in safe, secure environments tend to produce bigger babies. So the Velociraptors and the T-Rexes, they're in a quite safe environment. They are top predators, a lot of them. So they invest in, over time, we see the evolution of bigger babies. To have a bigger baby requires a thicker shell. So yeah, we see that in sharks as well, weirdly. So the larger predatory sharks, they're the ones that produce the bigger babies. And in their case, they don't lay a giant shelled egg. They have the babies inside their body and give birth to beautiful little pups.
We've spoken a lot about animals that come from being laid as an egg, but what about those that don't? When did the lineage split to form mammals?
About 250 million years ago, we have this giant, much worse than the meteorite explosion that killed off most of the dinosaurs, an absolutely giant world event, often known as the Great Dying, which I'm sure you know all about, where we lost so many different parts of the animal family tree. And we think not long after that, so maybe 200 million years ago, there was another extinction event, and the climate was shifting quite a lot. And those cooler areas, we see the fossils of the earliest proto-mammals. So we think these were not laying eggs. They were giving birth to little live babies, probably giving them milk as well. Doing it like we mammals do it, essentially. That's quite an early innovation. And then branching off later are the marsupials, which are obviously giving birth to far smaller babies. So I call them marsupial maggots. But
nice.
Essentially, yeah, because they're living in habitats, certainly in the modern day, that are less predictable, often quite dry habitats. They've gone the opposite to the great white shark, the opposite to the big dinosaurs. They're producing smaller offspring, and then if things go wrong, they can, of course, just repeat their sort of reproductive cycle again, and off they go. I remember being taught about the origin of mammals as almost like a biblical story. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
They went into the desert and they came back hairy, and actually, it's not particularly novel. The evolution of keeping babies in the body, getting rid of the shell membrane, well, the hard shell membrane anyway, or the soft shell in some cases, and giving birth to a live baby. That's happened something like 150 times in the bony animal family tree. And in fact, it's still happening in many species of reptiles. So we have in the UK the common lizard, which gives birth to live babies. But yet some parts of its range in the Italian Alps, the same species of lizard can lay eggs. And even it will lay eggs, incredibly, it will lay eggs down low, on low altitudes, and then literally within a stone's throw, you can have populations that are giving birth to live babies on mountainsides.
That's incredible.
Yeah, so like in some groups, it's a more fluid process than I think we give it credit for. And in snakes particularly, it's something that seems to sort of come and go over sort of 100,000-year periods in some cases. But in mammals, obviously, I feel like we've gone quite a long way down the line. It's quite hard for us to just pop out an egg.
Yeah.
And the same with birds, of course, as well, Although with birds, I think it's partly the weight of the egg. To have internal babies for a bird probably wouldn't be able to fly. But yeah, so we don't see birds and mammals going back in evolutionary time or in evolutionary adaptations. But yeah, in some groups, particularly reptiles, yeah, it's still happening to this day, which is just cool.
We've spoken about the role that an egg can play, whether it's to ward off parasites, whether it's to do with sun protection and all of those factors that we talked about. So how do eggs play a role in mammals? Where do they come into the story?
So if you think about the mammal embryo, I mentioned the amnio egg, this reptilian egg, and how amazing it was. Essentially, those membranes inside the egg, in mammals, they've sort of morphed together. So a couple of those membranous sacs have sort of wrapped around each other and are what we would call the umbilical cord. Okay. And then on the other side of that, you've got the placenta, which is kind of like the negotiator between mother and baby. And that evolutionary switch is pretty magnificent when you think about it, right? So if you think about a fish laying an egg, it's made the egg in its body and it's gone, here is the amount of yolk that egg has had. The egg is now free, it's released. There is no more negotiation between baby and mother. In animals like mammals, there is still a negotiation. As the embryo develops, you can have some embryos in a population more hungry than others and like pulling more resources out of mother and causing problems to mother. And essentially we see this weird sort of interplay really, especially in the animals that really, really need to grow massively. And especially in humans, of course, we've got a giant brain. So much of our resources go into powering and growing this brain as an embryo that essentially we have a situation where the baby's kind of fighting for more and more and more, and the mother's it's in the baby's interest, you could say, to fight for everything going, whereas it's in the mother's interest to give the baby the correct resources and possibly in future have another baby, ideally. So we see these different sort of requirements from mother and baby. And in humans, that's caused, in the book, I kind of refer to it as a kind of vampire-like, bloodthirsty placenta. But essentially, that's kind of what's going on there. You've got a placenta that really wants to kind of drill down. I should use quotation marks. It doesn't literally drill, but actually really get right far into the uterus wall. And that's not necessarily what the female mother would want. So obviously, in response, natural selection seen to it that the uterus has got really thick walls. So it's like, stop that baby from taking too much from me. The walls are so thick that essentially in our group, very rare in mammals, we have menstruation to essentially sort of flush out that heavy lining of the uterus, ready for next month again. We are sort of victims, if you like, of our really hungry, brainy embryos, which is kind of just odd, isn't it?
It sounds like the placenta has been a really pivotal part of the evolution of humans.
Yeah, as I say, it's only like 3 mammals, really, that, a couple of apes, and then, was it the elephant shrew that's the only mammals that have that sort of, it's not monthly in the case of elephant shrews, but essentially this menstruation. And then menopause is the other one as well, isn't it? It's very, very rare among mammals. Thing. So whales, some apes, and obviously humans. Essentially, the hunger of the placenta, this vampire, essentially, it is so energy demanding that it's better for females, we think, to obviously end the reproductive capability earlier in life and focus on extending the life as a result. And I think that's really cool. Elephants is similar as well. We're one of the secrets of our success is that we have extended life essentially to acquire more information about our world, about seasons, about water sources, about the best hunting sites. And actually, I think that is really beautiful. This life extension has instilled us with culture as a species.
So it's apparent how eggs have adapted through the various environmental challenges that the history of the Earth has thrown at them. But we've kind of got a new challenge in our midst now, a man-made challenge, which is climate change. Can we already see any changes occurring in eggs as a result of this?
Yeah, my feeling is pretty much every animal group on Earth is adapting. We would expect their egg routines to change as the climate changes. And what we see, those animals that we know best are the ones we know most about, right? So birds in Britain, we have such an amazing culture of bird watching and bird spotting and recording information about birds that actually we have very, very good information already that in the last 2 decades or so, we've seen, for some species, egg laying begin 8 or 9 days earlier.
Wow, that sounds quite significant.
Absolutely. And we think for some species that could be a good thing. But by our climate changing so relatively quickly, what we don't understand is the effect that has on insects enough. And insects, obviously, birds are essentially timing their egg laying for the boom in insects. And if they mistime that and there's not enough caterpillars for things like blue tits, obviously that has effect on their populations. But also we have one of the cool things really, again, that we have in our museums in the UK especially, absolutely incredible number of specimens of bird eggs. And again, that allows us to know not just the phenology, so not just whether the timings of natural events are changing because of climate change, but also gives us a resource to sort of look at other things, for instance, pesticides, obviously Silent Spring, Rachel Carson's book, which first showed to the world essentially that pesticides were impacting on the thickness of bird eggshells. We've got that resource in museums to compare modern day eggs in the field with what was going on 100 years or so ago. For me, one of the biggest sort of worries essentially is, yes, climate change, but also pollutants. some pesticides are very good at targeting snails, for instance. And snails, the shells, are what birds are seeking out to get enough calcium for their eggs. So essentially, by getting rid of snails, what impact will that have on birds and their egg requirements? So we might well see something like Silent Spring again, and it will be bird eggs that tell us kind of what's going on. But insect eggs are clearly changing. And in the book, in fact, spider eggs as well are sort of changing.
Oh, wow.
And there's a lovely type of wolf spider that lives in the Arctic Circle in North America. And about 15 years or so ago, this was a spider that reproduced once a year, just in spring, produced egg sacs. And now, because the temperatures are warmer, essentially there's more insect prey for those spiders, they can afford to essentially have 2 lots of reproductive opportunities a year. So they're producing 2 lots of eggs. Now, that sounds kind of like, okay, fair enough. But remember that there's basically one of these every square meter on the tundra. So if you imagine, if you're essentially potentially almost doubling the number of eggs that one species is producing, the impact that will have, we just don't know yet. But it will be fascinating to see, how strong and impactful, I suppose, those changes are on the ways that animals reproduce and create more seasons of eggs, I guess.
The one effect I think we've kind of seen on humans immediately is a massive spike in cases of Lyme disease, which, if I'm correct, it's the eggs are not being killed off in winter because it's not getting cold enough.
If you think about insects, it's really easy to think, oh, well, they're such a success story. They can fly around and they're really good at spreading their genes. But, I say this in the book, it's like, well, that's not quite the right way of putting it, essentially. They will lay eggs, most species, or many species, I should say, will lay eggs wherever they can. And it's the environment that's regulating which eggs hatch and which eggs do not. So essentially what we're seeing with arachnids and what we're seeing with insects, like mosquitoes, for instance, is we're seeing populations change according to where those eggs are now viable. So, many of the invasive species of mosquitoes that are moving across South America, but particularly South Europe at the moment, that will be the defining factor. And this is serious stuff. Obviously, we need to keep an eye on these invasive agents to stop ourselves getting stuck in another kind of disease crisis, I guess.
Jules, I wish we could sit around and talk about eggs all day. And if you're listening, you can read about them all day by reading Jules's new book, Infinite Life, which is out now. But sadly, we can't. So the last thing I want to ask you is, do you have a favourite egg and why?
I should know this. I should immediately be able to just go, right.
You can take some time to think if you need
to. I like shield bug eggs. So if you, at this time of year, so we're recording in spring, so basically spring or summer, if you just pluck an oak leaf off the tree and just have a look at it, there's nearly always some sort of egg on there. So it might be shield bug eggs, which look like, if you look at pool balls or snooker balls in a triangle. They're not in a triangle, but they're really nicely packed together. I like a bit of order in my eggs,
Sure,
and you get a nice bit of symmetry. They're all packed together really closely so that they can create a sort of microclimate of humidity that the egg obviously likes. And you can also see the little eyes looking through as the embryos grow. Their eyes are already peeking out and looking at you, so it's really cute. But also you've got things like within the leaf itself, you've got minor caterpillars. So these are type of moth caterpillar, and essentially they move through the leaf, and you can see their little galleries, their little tunnels, and again you often see their eggs at the stem. Galls as well. These are the sort of essentially nursery grounds for wasp grubs. So the wasp injects a special chemical alongside her egg that creates a hard bit on the base of the branch or the leaf, or sometimes on the twigs. So yeah, these eggs are all kind of around us really, and we don't really observe them as much. So I'm going to go for those 3, I think.
I think they're 3 great options. Jules, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Lia.
That's it for this episode. Thanks for listening. RI Science podcast episodes are released on the last Wednesday of every month. But in the meantime, you can explore more science on our YouTube channel, or browse our upcoming talks at rigb.org.